We're live, but we let it count up a few seconds. So there's a little something to pull. We don't cut anything good off. All right, let's go live here. Bam, reveal. What has been the biggest surprise through 3 weeks of the season? That more this week on the couch. Matthew Berry, through 3 weeks of NFL action, what has surprised you the most?
I mean, how long do we have? The fact that through 3 weeks in ESPN standard scoring, the number one player in fantasy is not Kyler Murray, it's not Patrick Mahomes, it's not even a quarterback. It's my little Cooper Kupp.
Yeah.
I mean, listen, no one loves Cooper Kupp more than me. Maybe Mrs. Kupp, maybe his wife, maybe Mama Kupp, but I love me my little Cooper Kupp. I have for years. It's been a long running bit. I met Cooper and interviewed him once, and he was actually game enough to. We did a little bit that I've shared on social a few times where, he introduces himself as Matthew's little Cooper Kupp, like he's aware of it, and even in my wildest dreams, Sig, did I not think through 3 games, no one, not one player in fantasy would have more fantasy points than Cooper Kupp's 91.2 through 3 weeks. Again, ESPN standard scoring. Tom Brady's 2, Kyler Murray's 3, Patrick Mahomes is 4, Derrick Henry's 5, Mike Williams is 6.
Wow, yeah.
Kirk Cousins is 7. I mean, listen, Mike Williams was a sleeper for me. I'm sure he's a sleeper for you. A lot of people liked him in the preseason.
Right.
We bought into Joe Lombardi, bringing over the Saints system, using him as the X. We bought into that. But did we think he would be better than Keenan Allen? Did we think he would be better than Josh Allen after 3 weeks? We did not. No. I'll say I did not. Maybe you're very smart.
No.
You did. But I did not.
No.
Those are among the surprises. And then on a personal level, just how unbelievably bad my Washington football team defense is. We're brutal. You know what I mean? Like, that was supposed to be the strength of the offense. I was excited. Sig, I had hope. Do you understand? Like, look at me. I'm not a man that has hope often.
Right.
I'm not a man that, lives on hope. I'm a man that wallows in despair. I'm a man that embraces it, that lives in the darkness. I'm Bane. You know what I mean? I was bored into it. Right? I mean, That's me. And yet coming into the season, I had hope. We had, in theory, like a top 3 NFL defense. Washington's football team. For people that listen to the show that aren't familiar, I'm a diehard since I was 5 years old fan of the Washington professional football team, and I had hope. Like, I thought we would be, good. Like, I thought, hey, you know what? We won the division last year with a bunch of guys. We won the division last year with a bunch of guys that no longer have jobs as starting quarterbacks in the NFL. Like, during the regular, I know Heineke, whatever. I know Heineke won the playoff game, but during the regular season last year, Washington's 3 starting quarterbacks were current Steelers backup Dwayne Haskins, current Washington third-teamer Kyle Allen, and current ESPN colleague of mine, Alex Smith. Like, one guy's not even in football anymore. And the other two, and those were the quarterbacks for Washington, and they still, even though it was the NFC least, I get it, but they still, listen, they won a division title. They went to the playoff game. They gave Tom Brady the toughest matchup, honestly, of any of the teams that faced the Bucs during the playoff run last year. I'm like, now they got Fitzy. They added some weapons on offense. Second year of Antonio Gibson. Second year of Logan Thomas. Like, as long as their offense is competent, that defense is carrying them to the title of the division and possibly far in the playoffs. And we can't stop anyone. So that's been the biggest surprise for me, which it shouldn't be. Why should I be surprised that Washington has let me down again? But weirdly, I'm surprised by that. I did legitimately think we were going to have an amazing defense.
The door was open with Fitzpatrick for that Fitzmagical thinking that what could this team become? And then meanwhile, the Cowboys all of a sudden have a defense. Dan Quinn has worked his magic. So I have no idea what's going on. You mentioned Mike Williams and Cooper Kupp, and it's funny because I had a thought earlier this week. If you just took Mike Williams and Cooper Kupp, it doesn't really matter who else you took. You could have let your cat make the rest of your picks, and you probably will be in first place in your league, which is why fantasy football is silly. And this is why, folks out there, I'm sure Matthew Berry, and if you want to know what he's thinking about this week's starts and sits. You have plenty of chances to do that. But I'd much rather just turn this to a whole off the rails. Plus, I like that you have already jumped into the couch theme, because this is about working things out. And I continue to say that fantasy football is mainly therapy. We need
How
therapy.
long do we have? Because I have a lot of stuff to get off my chest. I have a lot of issues, Sig. To be honest with you, we may not.
I'm here for you.
This all in one episode.
No, we're just getting started.
We'll do it in like 15 years, so I don't think we're going to be able to do it in one episode. But if I'm game to try.
Yeah, well, and I think the important thing that we start out with is that this is a safe place, and this is a part of the fantasy football theme, right? Because I think what has made fantasy football so popular is that everything else fades into the background when you're managing your team and when you're at your draft or whatever. And I think that the therapy that comes with fantasy football is you're in control in some ways. I mean, you're in control of your choices. Otherwise, it's completely out of your control. But fantasy football creates that safe space, and then we can get things off our chest. But I actually wanted to flip it and start with this, because I've always told people, I'm sure that you have so many things going on that you don't even really have time to notice this now. But I know you went through a period where it's in some ways, I don't want to compare you to Roger Goodell, but I think of Roger Goodell because I feel like Roger Goodell's out there for everyone to throw tomatoes at. So the owners, the cartel, can do what they want to do. And when things go wrong, they just it's Roger Goodell. It's Roger Goodell. And that's why he gets paid so well. I felt for you at times because you are the one who all the tomatoes get thrown at. So the rest of us continue to have some sense of, self-esteem because we pretend to predict the future. Fantasy football analysis is, at one point in my life, I wanted to be an astrologer, or at least I was thinking about being an astrologer, because people will just pay you to talk about them. People will pay you to talk about their fantasy teams. How has it been? Because I know abuse is a strong word, but sometimes I feel like you take abuse on behalf of all the rest of us. Is that something that even registers on your radar at this point? How's that figured into the trajectory of Matthew Berry?
It doesn't. It did for a long time. It did bother me. It doesn't anymore. Weirdly, this came up on our podcast that we did this morning. I appreciate that. And it's a double-edged sword, right? In that, and I'll probably give you a longer answer than you actually want. But so the one hand, it's sort of like at this point it doesn't really register for a few reasons. I'm older. It's sort of I no longer, give a. I was going to use a different word, but no longer give an S.
Yeah.
Or an F. Pick a letter. And
sorry,
I've
Joe.
also taken precautions. Like I don't read my Twitter mentions very much. You know what I mean? Like I've muted a lot of people. I have stuff filtered out. I tend not to read I'll just tweet something and then I won't read replies to it. Only on a few things. When I actually want feedback, like I'm curious what people think about this trade or this team or this or that, then I will read, or I'll occasionally crowdsource for a column or a piece of content. But other than that, I don't really read, just being honest here. I don't really read my responses. Certainly not on Twitter. Instagram, I do more. I think they do a better job of curating normalcy. And, the other thing is that, I always say that it's interesting that, that when I joined ESPN, and it was a long time ago, in 2007, but in 2007, when I had joined ESPN, I had been a fantasy analyst for a long time. I had my own website, Talents of Mr. Roto, which I'd done for about 3 years. And along the way, while I was at Talents of Mr. Roto, I'd done a bunch of fantasy analysis for a bunch of other companies. I'd done stuff for NBA and NBA.com, MLB.com, Sporting News. Did some stuff, obviously, for Roto World. I started at Roto World, and I wrote there for 4.5 years, and then I, eventually branched off to my own site, but I was still doing stuff for Roto World. Did some stuff for Fox Sports and Fox Sports Radio. So did a lot of different things and was out there quite a bit. CBS Sportsline did a handful of things there, and so it was really weird, Sigmund, that whatever level of analyst I am, say I'm a 10, say I'm a 2, whatever number, or even a 1, right? Wherever you think I am, and I'm just saying the general you, not you specifically, Sigmund.
Sure.
But whatever level of analyst I was at, I was the same level of analyst the day before I joined ESPN and the day after.
Mm-hmm.
And yet the day after I joined ESPN, I don't think I'd ever gotten, or if I'd gotten hate mail, it'd been very, very infrequent prior to joining ESPN. Social media back then wasn't what it is now today either, but all of a sudden it changed. The minute I became ESPN's senior fantasy football analyst, literally that's my job title. That's
right.
I'm a full-time employee of the Walt Disney Company, and that's literally my job title. I'm ESPN's senior fantasy football analyst. The minute I became that, and the power of those 4 letters, people expected me to know everything. It was sort of like, it was just like, suddenly like I was, before I was like this indie band that had a couple of cool hits, and now all of a sudden, like I'm this mainstream sellout arena band, and you're like, no, dude, like I still got the same 3 songs.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, and so that was really eye-opening to me, was just because of my association with ESPN. And it's nothing, I don't know, I definitely think there are people that don't like ESPN for whatever reason, for a variety of reasons. But I also think that there is, I think there was just some sort of expectation that once you have this job, you need to be able to predict the future. So there's that. The last piece of that I'll answer for you, Sig, is that it's and it's hard sometimes, if I'm being honest, right? Sometimes it's hard to, turning down my computer. That's my emails. Always just keep going up. One of the other things that becomes a challenge, it's a double-edged sword. The reason I get so much grief is because my picks are more public.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and this isn't like, I'm not trying to denigrate anyone. I'm certainly not trying to brag, but my picks are front and center on the largest sports media company in the world. The largest sports media company in the world. More people play fantasy football with ESPN than any other company in the world. We have an insanely popular podcast. We have an insanely popular TV show on fantasy football now. My show, The Fantasy Show, does very well on ESPN Plus. And my love-hate column, again, this is not bragging. This is all stuff that's been released by ESPN. This is all public information that have been press releases and that kind of stuff. My love-hate column is one of, if not the most read column on ESPN.com during the year. Regular column. Not certain, not specific, there's pieces that get, but in terms of a regular cadence to a column, it's certainly, to quote the old Bohm Phillips, I don't know if it's in a class by itself, but it doesn't take long to call the roll. And this is, again, like, you can say you don't like the column. People can say that the column sucks or whatever, or my show stinks or any of this stuff. I'm just purely on a numbers basis. ESPN is a bigger fire hose than everyone else. It is the largest sports media company in the world. And as a result of my job, my picks, my analysis, what I say on TV, what I say online, what I say in my podcast, gets seen, heard, and dissected more than many others.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I say something like, I'm trying to think of a good example. I mean, it's not like there's a zillion of them, but when I say something like, hey, last year, when I say, hey, Daniel Jones is my fantasy ride or die, when I say I really like, which is in essence, basically, I really like Daniel Jones as a sleeper last year, I was not alone in that.
Sure.
A lot of people had the same take, which is that, Daniel Jones was fantasy-wise was really good over the second half of the year. He's more mobile than you get credit for. Like, he's going to be like a good fantasy sleeper in his second year, in terms of, we don't think the defense is going to be particularly good. It'll be in a lot of shootouts, blah, 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 blah. Well, whatever. Obviously, that pick was horrifically bad. You don't expect Saquon Barkley to go down in the second game, the focal point of their offense, which changes everything, but whatever. Bad pick. If you took Daniel Jones last year because of me, it did not return value. Bad pick on me, asked and answered. But my point is that other people had Daniel Jones as a sleeper last year, and no one remembers that. They remember I said Daniel Jones.
Mm-hmm.
And so they remember that. They remember whatever. 2 weeks ago, I think I had I'm trying to think of a good one, like let me think about this past week. this past week I had Ezekiel Elliott on my hate list.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't like how they were using him. Didn't like the Eagles' defensive line. Thought the way that they could attack the Eagles, that when you think about, and you saw this if you watch any of the Peyton Eli telecast either, but they talked about this, that the Eagles always play two high safeties, and the middle of the field's always really open. And I thought the Eagles have a really good run defense, and that the way Dallas can attack Philadelphia is going to be similar to a game plan as what they did against Tampa Bay, which is to attack the edges and, quick passes over the middle, try to attack the middle of the field, do some slants. And in terms of Zeke's out usage, it'll be dump offs to Tony Pollard. It'll use him in the screen game, and do a lot of like short stuff, right? Short stuff in sort of the middle of the field. Zeke had a monster game, best game of the year. And I'm sure, and I ranked him 15th, which was not a crazy ranking for him, but certainly lower than where you drafted him. Love hate's all about expectations. I have to come up with hates every week. That's the gig. And so, you know what I mean? And like, I'm sure there were other people last week that did not like Ezekiel Elliott. People remember he was on my hate list because that love hate, even if you don't subscribe to ESPN Plus, even if you don't read the column, it's posted on social. It's done on TV. They run a 1.5-minute love hate segment on SportsCenter and and on NFL Live and other shows, Kellerman, etc. Blah 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 blah. And so, so the answer to that question, Sig, is while that part sucks, it sucks. You know what I mean? Like, it's not fun. I don't like getting calls wrong. I don't like getting called out on getting calls wrong. No one likes that. That's not fun. But the reverse of that, Sig, is that because of my position in the industry, because of the visibility I get thanks to ESPN, because of my following, I get to do some insanely cool stuff. And I get opportunities that, I have no business having been in. Like, so hey, does the hate stuff bother you, right? All the negativity about that kind of stuff. Like, well, sure. But did I like having a cameo in Avengers Endgame?
Right.
I really did. Like, that was awesome. That's like one of the top 5 moments of my life. Like, that experience and getting to be in that movie and the friends that I met on that set and my friendship that continues to this day with Joe Russo. And that's entirely because I'm the fantasy football guy for ESPN, and Joe Russo read my column and has read it for years and likes it. And we got connected by a mutual friend, and then we became friends. And if I'm writing for Talented Mr. Roto, I'm still on my own website, my own blog. That likely doesn't happen. I'm not getting the hate, but I'm not also getting cool stuff like that. You know what I mean? And I could talk about a zillion things that have happened to me that are amazing and incredible, like that are a result of people enjoying my content, and the way they've been exposed to my content is because of ESPN and the power of those 4 letters. So it's sort of a double-edged sword, and it sometimes gets hard to remember that, but I think it's important to remember that, and that's sort of how I try to look at it, is that you don't get one without the other. Like, if I was the only person that had a level of had a following that didn't get tomatoes, to use your phrase, then I would be like, why do they just hate me and no one else?
Right.
I mean, like, I see the kind of hate, I'll put it this way. I see the hate that, like, Stephen A. Smith gets here at a network. And whether Stephen A. Smith is your cup of tea or not, Stephen A. Smith is really, really talented. He's really good at what he does. And he makes a lot of money for the company, for ESPN. You know what I mean? Like, I see hate that, like, Michelle Beadle, who used to work with us here at ESPN. Michelle Beadle is one of the best television hosts I've ever seen in my life. She's so good at what she does. People don't understand how good Michelle Beadle is. And I would see hate that she would get. I'm like, well, come on. You want to hate me, that's fine. I get it. But how do you hate Beadle?
Mm-hmm.
Beadle's awesome. Like, I mean, like, and just taking it outside of ESPN, for example. Like, I see people that, they hate on Joe Buck. Joe Buck, do you guys have any idea how good Joe Buck is at what he does? I mean, like, it is so hard to be a play-by-play guy and to be that proficient at different. Joe Buck is again, he may not be your cup of tea, but I'm just telling you from a broadcasting standpoint, he is so good at what he does. Like, you have no idea how talented Joe Buck is. Or, pick an announcer, Mike Tirico, whatever, like Al Michaels, Chris Collinsworth. People complain about all of them, and you're just like, man, those guys are so good. Romo, you know what I mean? Like, Romo's great, man. Like, I don't know. You know what I mean? You always see it. There are people that don't like Barkley. Barkley's the greatest sports analyst in the history of television. Any sport.
Yeah.
There's a large group of people that can't stand Charles Barkley. And I'm like, you guys are nuts, man. Like, anyway, so I try to sort of, think about, not that I'm comparing myself to any of those people. They're all amazing and great, but merely like, just like, if those amazing people are getting grief, tomatoes to your point, then, what hope does some schmuck like me have?
And you anticipated a question that we don't necessarily have to explore, because I was going to ask also that these things take on a life of their own, and sometimes you're along for the ride, and you've definitely been along for the ride. And I was going to ask you, do you wish you could have? Yeah, I was going to ask you, do you wish you could hit the pause button, or maybe go back a few steps, because of how you're a passenger, you're not really the driver as much, even though I'm sure at moments you get a hold of the wheel. But I want to say, going to piggyback off of what you said, it is because you're up on literally on the big screen. If we talk about Avengers, but also broadcast out to those millions of people, or read by millions of people, and it creates a dehumanizing effect. It's the same thing that happens with football players. It's the reason that you can jump on social media after a game and see the guy who missed the field goal or dropped the interception, and the ridiculous hatred that are pointed at those players, or people that otherwise there's this distance or a sense that they're not human, or they're remote from us. Whereas, say, I'm going to keep saying his name, and I know you did, and a lot of other people too, Mike Tagliere, who we're going to miss, but is still with us. We have a closer relationship with our audience. It's kind of like we're buddies. We're hanging out during games, or we're hanging out setting our lineups, and it's not the same. But I hope that people see. I think that my audience isn't really the people this would be directed at. That you actually do care. You actually care. You're not just sending in the work, and like you said, you don't read your mentions probably for your mental health, but you certainly care about the quality of your work, and you care. And I think that a lot of people don't miss that. You mentioned Tony Romo, and you mentioned Eli and Peyton, and I got to ask you this.
So is there? Hang
go
on
ahead.
A second. I'm just curious. So
yeah,
I appreciate everything you're just saying. Is there? I'm not really sure if there was a question in there, or
no,
you wanted to explore.
Well, I mean, I'll just ask you straight up. If you could go back and pause this, or like steer it a little differently, because I also, like you said, it's given you a lot of opportunities.
Pause this. What does that mean?
Well, just that, I mean, even just the whole fantasy industry, right? I mean, when we all started doing this, however long ago it was, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, I don't think anybody could have ever pictured this. DraftKings just offered $20 billion for a company, and we can remember 10 years ago, and that was just some dudes. PFF just got bought for some minority. I remember when PFF was just a handful of dudes. It was just an idea with some people who wanted to make it happen. And then when I say pause, this, what I mean.
Your question: did we miss the boat, Sig? Have we missed it out completely?
Yeah, that's where my therapy comes in, right? Because I'm not ambitious.
I remember meeting Jason Robbins at a fantasy sports conference in 2012. It was just like, hey, I want to introduce myself. We just left Vistaprint, and we're starting this daily fantasy company called DraftKings. Nice to meet you, Jason. Jason and I have been friends and remain friends since that time. But it's crazy. Yeah. So yes, did you and I screw up somehow with our careers? I think we did. I think we did. If that's the question, if you want to say all the missed opportunities that you and I have seen just sort of pass us by, where we're sitting there banging out start sits, then I think so. Let's cry.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we have the careers we're supposed to have. It's just getting used to that idea. But you mentioned the Eli and Peyton show, and I don't want to go too close to the third rail, and I don't want to try to induce you to mention or talk about ESPN specifically. But I do want to say that the Eli and Peyton Monday Night Football is truly refreshing.
Yeah,
and I think a lot. I'm going to mention a world famous Eric Stoner here. That it's a lot like because who in the world have ever thought fantasy football podcasts would become this sector of the media? But here we are. And I think part of it is because it's talking about football and experiencing football the way we actually do, and not the way that it's in a polished, packaged form. Because I can go back to, you mentioned Joe Buck and play-by-play. I wanted to be the play-by-play announcer for the Pittsburgh Pirates when I was a kid. You can do whatever you want to do. That's what I wanted to do. Went to Syracuse, Newhouse School, et cetera. And getting an up-close view of the business back in the 90s, I thought, maybe this isn't for me. And then sure enough, the internet creates this backdoor. It's democratic media now. You can just, the barriers to entry have been broken down. You can broadcast worldwide for free, basically. But you're right. It's really difficult work. It's really difficult work because it's so polished. The 2 years that I was in front of the camera, I was so nervous about making a mistake that I just couldn't be human. I couldn't project myself in a human way and connect with people the way I can when I'm just behind the microphone. Well, if people say I can, I shouldn't really say that. But my point is that Peyton and Eli and the way that they are presenting football, I think, is connecting with people in a way that not anything else in sports media, in capital S, capital M sports media. Do you think that they could be, and Tony Romo too, because he's just so, he's casual, he's so intelligent and knowledgeable and conveys that to you, but in a casual way that makes you feel comfortable while you're listening to him do color for a game. Do you think there's a chance that we could see some of these things bubble up from the lowercase s sports media to uppercase s sports media with Peyton and Eli leading the way?
Sure, there's always a chance. Listen, I think that, and I don't want to be like a total, quote, company man here. I mean, like, I don't agree with everything that ESPN does. I don't want to sit here and say that I love everything that ESPN puts out in terms of programming. But I will tell you that I think genuinely that the Peyton and Eli show, I think is fantastic. And I love watching the games through them. I think it's a challenge, right? I think it works because there's a variety of reasons it works, but I think it mostly starts working because it's Peyton Manning. Like, I don't think that show works with Eli and somebody else.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, it might work with Peyton and somebody else. But, like, for example, I found some of the coaches, I think it works because Peyton's not only Peyton Manning in capital letters, one of not the greatest quarterback of all time, right? Legit Hall of Famer, right? I mean, like, just, GOAT, right? GOAT status. So it works not only because Peyton Manning just has this built-in authenticity as like who's going to ever question Peyton Manning about anything on football?
Mm-hmm.
But also because of his years of being, whether it's a commercial spokesperson or MC, hosting Saturday Night Live, like, he has a lot of experience in front of a camera. He hosted the ESPYs, I believe, one year. Like, he's just a charming dude. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, America likes Peyton Manning, the person. America likes the persona of Peyton Manning. And so you combine, his extreme likability as just not a character, but as a personality,
mm-hmm.
along with his unmatched authenticity as an expert in the field. And then, by the way, it's his brother, somebody who's not intimidated by Peyton, somebody who's willing to, like, give him grief and make fun of him and talk trash
steer him. Eli sometimes will say
himself.
Yeah.
I mean, Eli, that's the thing. It's like, if Eli were a less successful NFL quarterback, but they have the same number of Super Bowl rings, those two guys do.
Yeah.
And Eli's going to be in the Hall of Fame, and so I think it works. So do I think that opens the idea to? So my answer is yes and no. I think does it open people's eyes to the ideas that less traditional broadcasts can work? It does. And I'll say that, like, on ESPN Plus, I know we tried I believe for the first game, there was a broadcast that was done, the NFL Live crew. So, Marcus Spears, Laura Rutledge, Dan Orlovsky, Mina Kimes, and the Daily Wager crew, led by Doug Gazarian. They did a joint broadcast that focused on both X's and O's and gambling, actually, and that aired on ESPN Plus. So they're trying some stuff. Do we get to a game broadcast where there's fantasy? Would absolutely love that, obviously. Would love that opportunity. Mm-hmm. I don't know that that's in the cards, but and I don't know if that's in the cards at ESPN. And by the way, if it were in the cards at ESPN, I couldn't tell you. But for the record, I have no knowledge of any plans for that. What I will say, though, is that I think that somebody somewhere, might try that, especially as seeing the success of that. So I think it is. So do I think that's opened the door to alternative broadcasts? I do, but I also think that that I don't think just they can throw anyone on there.
Right.
Right. I mean, like, it's got to be the right talent, the right personalities, the right person or persons with gravitas and, a personality and unmatched authority in the space, the way that Peyton Manning does. That's why that works. And, it's been an unbelievable success, but also still does, 20% of the audience that the main broadcast does on Monday Night Football.
Right.
So it's brand new and it's on ESPN 2 versus ESPN, and that certainly makes a difference. But there's always gonna be, I think, a large portion of the audience that prefers a traditional broadcast.
And I think you're right to point out that it might seem like this can work and be reproduced, but it can work and be reproduced without Peyton, because the other thing is when they bring in the guests, they're comfortable. The guests are comfortable. They're not in interview mode. They're just hanging out. And I think that's part of what makes it so attractive.
But I don't think every guest has worked. That's the other thing.
That's true.
I'll be honest with you. I mean, this is sacrilege to say, but did you watch the Peyton and Eli broadcast the last game?
You mean a couple of days ago? I saw
Cowboys game.
Like part of it. Yeah.
Did you see Nick Saban?
Well, that's probably where we turned it off. I think at that point the game was getting out of hand, and he wasn't really.
Right.
Yeah.
Saban's a legend, right? I mean, make no mistake. Saban has forgotten more about football in the last 10 seconds than I'll know about football my entire life. Nick Saban is
Yeah.
But I thought as a guest on that show, it was I didn't think he was, super compelling as a personality. Right. And I didn't feel like he offered it. I was more and they were reminiscing a little bit about, times that Peyton played against him when he was in Miami, when Saban was in Miami, and, in the pros, and, when Eli played him in college, and they had some fun there. But I was just I was kind of get back to the game. I really enjoy Peyton and Eli watching the game, and then sitting there going I can't believe Philadelphia is not changing out of this defense, and and Peyton's disgust when he sees what he thinks bad calls, and and him explaining that's the stuff that, for me at least, and I'm sure it's so it's some guests have been great. I thought Stafford was great. I thought Saban was yeah, I mean that didn't that wasn't as compelling a guest for me. And the guests, because listen, a Peyton Manning interview show, I'm down for.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But if we're watching the game, I want to talk about the game. I want, and I love hearing these two, brilliant quarterbacks analyze the game. And if the guest they have can join them and do that, Russell Wilson did that some in his first appearance. Anyway, whatever. I don't need to fix that show. That show's doing great. Everyone at ESPN obviously is thrilled with it. And I think it's a real triumph for the company and for Peyton and Eli and for broadcasting. I think because I agree with you, Sig, which is the premise of this question was, do you think the success of the Manningcast will now open up alternative forms of broadcasting at other companies? And I think the answer is yes. And we're starting to see it, right? It's when Nickelodeon did the CBS playoff game. I think that was considered success. And I think we'll see more of that kind of stuff. And, so.
Absolutely. I'm glad you went back to that, because I think that it's something. Football isn't quite as staid as baseball, but it's also not as hip or now as the NBA. Right. And the Nickelodeon broadcast, I watched that with my wife and my 8-year-old stepson, and he loved it. He absolutely loved it, and she thought it was great. She's like, "Are they going to do more games like this? Couldn't we watch more games?" It doesn't have to be so rigid, and it doesn't have to be so. You mentioned Nick Saban not being a good guest, and I think that Deadspin ran something like maybe the Manningcast is good because they don't talk to the coaches, and maybe that specific point is not necessarily something we would hang our hat on. But the idea is it's casual, it's human, And that even when they have Archie on the couch with Eli making fun of Peyton, scolding him and things like that, it's human and it's relatable, and it's probably part of the reason that I veered away from podcast journalism. But a long time ago, by the way, you just reminded me that in my first year in Com 101, I had to write the big paper at the end, and I wrote it about ESPN too because it was brand new. The idea was, can a second ESPN actually work? Is there enough of an appetite out there for two channels? That's how far we've come. That's how old I am. So I wanted to go back.
But
and
we're in an era, and then we can move on to anything else.
Yeah, sure.
But I was just going to say, we're also in an era now where people are much more, and I think it's twofold. I think it's the advent of social media.
Yeah.
Right. So people are now growing up. Like all my kids do is watch YouTube and TikTok and Instagram. My older kids are on Instagram, but that's literally all they do. Those three kids, like, you know what I mean? Like my daughter will barely turn on the TV. She'll grab her iPad and watch TikTok videos or, you know, YouTube, and we have them on restricted mode, and we monitor all that stuff. But like, it's like, that's what they watch. So kids are growing up, and they're, because of the proliferation of YouTube and other social media, people are used to seeing sort of low rent production value. People talking to the camera, like just, you know, whatever. That, and then you think about the fact of just coming out of this pandemic where so much was had to do from Zoom, and like, you know, here's Jimmy Fallon doing the Tonight Show from his house, you know, and so those two things combined, that we as a country are much, much, much more conditioned, open, and accepting of a broadcast like this, where I'm clearly in my office and you're clearly like in a room at your house.
Right.
You know what I mean? And people aren't like, where's the production value on this? Right. I mean, like they're, so I think that in addition is one of the reasons why, you know, the Manningcast is really well produced, but it's a very casual look. Peyton and Eli don't have jackets. They're not in ties. They're clearly, you know, both sitting at home. You know, they're not in the same room. Anyway, so.
It makes sense. No, this is a good discussion, though, because I think that it's kind of like what happens in football, Matthew, where it's like coaches think that their special system and their special scheme is what makes a team win, and then they force players into it when really it was something else. It was the players, or it was something else than what their fingerprints are all over. Like, what if the production values were never actually what drew people in the first place?
That's right.
And that and the thing is, like you said, we've been going through changes over the last year and a half, and unfortunately, I don't see an end. It isn't like we're going to snap our fingers and next year everything's going to go back to the way it was. I think people are lonely. I think people are more isolated now, and some humanity. I still think that podcasts are a big deal because it's a human voice. I think a human voice is one of the most comforting things, like bedtime stories and things like that. Go ahead.
Well, it's also, you know, it's also in terms of podcasts, it's also an intimate medium, right?
Right.
You know, I always talk about that with the podcast. I think one of the success. Listen, the podcast we do at ESPN, the Fantasy Focus 06010, available wherever you get your podcasts, wherever you listen to this, you can get Fantasy Focus that I do every day with Field Yates and Stefania Bell. What I would tell you about that podcast is, like, listen, I think I give good fantasy advice. I think Field gives good fantasy advice. Stefania is the best in the business. If you ask me, all due respect to all other medical experts out there. But the truth is that I think the people that listen to that show just enjoy that universe, right? They like me and Field and Stefania and Daniel, our producer, and the interplay between the four of us, and they enjoy fantasy football and they want to get advice on how to win. But they also they just like that universe, and like it's an intimate medium. Like when you listen to a podcast, you're in your car. I'm in your ear as you walk the dog, or or you mow the lawn, or whatever it is. And so, it's not something that you can. It's not a TV show that you turn on in the background while you're making dinner or something like that, and it's just sort of white noise. It's like you have to actively seek out the content and consume it. And so, that's one of the reasons why I think, podcasting is so special and interesting. And it's one of the things we've tried to focus on with our show in terms of trying to build the audience over there. It's interesting you mentioned, I don't know if you have another topic. I was going to
go ahead.
Off of one of the things you said, which is talking about coach and scheme. The best coaches basically say, like, okay, What have I got to work with?
Right.
Emphasize what this player does well. Let me, try to hide what this player does not. The worst coaches, I think, just sort of say, like, this is the system and we're going to run it. And it's really interesting. And the reason because I think one of the biggest storylines in fantasy football right now, and it leads into this topic really well. We can get back to football here for a second.
Sure.
Is Chicago and Justin Fields and Matt Nagy. And it's really tough, because Justin Fields did not look good. And I'm being kind. He did not look good last Sunday against the Browns. And people are giving Matt Nagy all sorts of grief about his play calling. But there's a chance, Sig, that, and we have no idea, and I certainly do not have any idea, just so you know, I'm speculating here. But there's a chance he doesn't have Andy Dalton. He knows he's got to start Justin Fields. He's the high draft pick. But he's seeing in practice. This guy can't read coverages. This guy can only go to his first read. I don't know. You know what I mean? Like, maybe Matt Nagy designed an offensive game plan based on what he thought Justin Fields could do. There's also a chance, this is something Fields said on the show this morning too, is, they don't have to be mutually exclusive. Justin Fields could be not ready for prime time, and Matt Nagy also called a bad game.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. So there's all those things that are factors. But they play Detroit. They're at home against Detroit, a winless Detroit team. Though the Lions have really, shown some grit. Right? They've been pesky, as it were. Like they should have beaten Baltimore. And they haven't gotten blown out. I thought they hung tough with, for Green Bay for much of that game. So, and obviously San Francisco, they made that furious comeback against the Niners. So what do you do with Justin Fields? And more importantly, Sig, what do you do with Allen Robinson and David Montgomery? Because if we're going off of last week, that offense looked unusable from top to bottom.
Mm-hmm.
But it's Detroit. And Andy Dalton practiced a little today. What do we do with that offense? So I have a thought, but I'm curious as to your thoughts. And this was, I thought, maybe an interesting conversation.
Yeah, well, I think that whatever we see signs of hope, it probably is a mirage, or like you said, maybe it's just the matchup against Detroit this week. I look back and I wonder if we have any evidence that Matt Nagy is an offensive genius. It's shades of Adam Gase, right? You're there for something really good that happens and you get some of the credit for it. You can go back to Mitchell Trubisky when he was first in there, and I think there was a game against Tampa Bay when everything worked. But when we look over the years, what if we end up finding out that Mitchell Trubisky a few years from now gets another shot somewhere and is actually an okay quarterback? Maybe if we're always solving for X, right? X being some sort of unknown based on all these different variables that are crashing together when we watch. And I just think that at this point, if you can get 50 cents on the dollar for Allen Robinson or David Montgomery, you probably do it, because there's no scenario. I don't think Ted Phillips has the will to remove Matt Nagy during the season. With Fields, and when Myles Garrett, who's wonderful, Myles Garrett is a wonderful addition to the NFL on many levels. He comes out and say, "Well, we thought they were going to do something. They were going to move him outside." I would imagine the game plan that Cleveland was preparing for would have had more success. Anything would have had more success. It was one of the worst offensive games in NFL history. So you just question the judgment. So even if going up against a defense this week in Detroit that in the secondary has so many problems, is that sustainable? Is that how they're going to play every week? I don't. But
here's the argument. Here's the counter argument. They have had success. David Montgomery was a top 5 fantasy running back last year.
Mm-hmm.
He was unbelievable down the stretch, despite having Mitch Trubisky and Nick Foles. And this isn't the first place where Nick Foles has not performed up to expectations.
Right.
Despite having Mitchell Trubisky and Nick Foles, despite having, let's call it, uneven quarterback play, Allen Robinson still very useful in fantasy last year. David Montgomery was great last year. Some of that was they had an amazing schedule on the stretch. Some of it was Tariq Cohen leaves. They didn't have a lot of depth behind Montgomery, so he ended up getting insane volume, especially in the passing game. But the fact is that there have been productive fantasy players. By the way, that goes to Jimmy Graham, was a productive fantasy tight end last year, given the state of the position such as it is. And we saw glimmers of hope for Cole Kmet and Darnell Mooney out of that offense. So regardless of whether Matt Nagy can coach, and I'm with you, he was with Andy Reid in Kansas City, pretty sure if you made me the offensive assistant Kansas City, Chiefs would be really, really good because you still got Andy Reid and you still got Patrick Mahomes.
Right.
I'd sort of hide my dumb ass in the corner, right? But I'd have the title. So, right, we have no evidence, I understand, to your point. But we do have evidence that Matt Nagy coached players can be productive fantasy players.
Yeah.
Inconsistent quarterback play.
Yeah, absolutely.
Bears
and
last year, as bad as the Bears offense was last year, they were top 12 in pass attempts and offensive plays from scrimmage.
Yeah, and so what'll be interesting to see is you almost wonder if there can be something like a miniature mutiny where the players. This is what I'm looking for in Jacksonville tomorrow night. Is if the players just say, "Well, who cares about Urban Meyer and how he's steering the team? We have our pride to play for. We have ourselves to play for, because of how poor." Remember, Joe Burrow has thrown 3 interceptions in 4 attempts. Joe Burrow hadn't thrown an interception in 199 attempts. He throws 3 interceptions in 4 attempts, and that's how the Bears beat the Bengals. Otherwise, we would be looking at this Bears team and looking at the Giants holding the Bears first-round pick and thinking, "Oh man, how high is that first-round pick going to be?" So we'll see. But I think you're right to highlight that as a big fork in the road for folks. Because
we did a segment on our podcast today that was like, "Who was your toughest player to rank?" And Robinson was one of them. Robinson and Robert Woods. Those were my 2.
Yeah, well, Robert Woods. I mean, that's another one where you're just stuck waiting for him to go off. I call it fantasy probation, where you have someone on your bench until they go off on your bench, and then you consider them again. But otherwise, you feel like Lucy in the football. Every time you put them in, you think, well, this week could be the week.
What would you do, Sig? I'm curious. What would you do if so? I think I'm probably not trying to acquire Allen Robinson, but I think at this point, I'm going to wait to, his value's at an all-time low right now.
Right.
Unless I desperately need to just take anything, I think I'd rather take my chances with Allen Robinson on Sunday against the Lions. Even though I ranked him as a wide receiver 3 this week, I'd rather take my chances than trade him, because hopefully he has a good game, and then if you want to deal him, you can deal him.
Right.
But I think that, if nothing else, everyone was just like, "I can't believe you're starting Andy Dalton. I can't believe you're starting Andy Dalton. QB1, joke. And we can sit here and say what a terrible play call that, a game plan that was from Matt Nagy, but there's literally nothing that you saw last week that made you think, what are they doing going back to Andy Dalton?
Right.
You sort of get it, right? I mean, so even if the answer is Matt Nagy wants to run the system he runs and Andy Dalton can perform it better than Justin Fields, and it's the wrong system for Justin Fields, okay, fine, but whatever. Matt Nagy's the head coach. This is a system. We're not at practice. We don't know anything, but just based on what we've seen so far, Sig, if you and I were head coach of the Bears and Andy Dalton was healthy and available to play, I think you and I both would be like, Andy Dalton starting Sunday.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it also sets up these difficult questions, because we're seeing this with Zach Wilson. I think we're seeing this with Trevor Lawrence to an extent. Yeah. I believe in that Freudian imprinting. Go back to David Carr, and how things go for a quarterback earlier in their career can completely alter the course of their career. And you wonder whether, it's like the baby is dying in the crib and they're not ever going to get a chance to grow up because of the environment they're in. So maybe the best thing for Justin Fields might be, for the long-term health of the franchise, to let Andy Dalton absorb all the licks. If the team, and again, I think the brass might have clarity that they're going to move forward without Pace and Nagy, or at least Nagy, but I don't think we're going to see it happen during the season. Go ahead.
Which I agree with all that. And if that's the case, then I think you're right? I mean, I think it's less about what happens on the field, because all experience is good experience. And I think it's more about about the organization around him. And again, Peyton Manning's a special dude, but I believe Peyton Manning set the NFL record for interceptions his rookie year. Manning was bad, but you know what? But by the way, Peyton Manning had Tom Moore for what was it, the first 12 years of his NFL career? Like, he had the same system and the same guy forever. You know, I always, like, I'm a Washington fan, so I always think about this. You know, Jason Campbell came out of Auburn, where he'd had multiple offense coordinators. Jason Campbell had something like 4 different offense coordinators his first 4 years in the NFL. Is Jason Campbell Peyton Manning? Of course not. But I think Jason Campbell got a raw deal in the NFL. I do. Like, I think he would have been a better NFL quarterback had he gotten in there. And even if it was a bad system, he got 4. You know, I mean, we're seeing it play out somewhat with Sam Darnold.
Mm-hmm.
Think about if Ryan Tannehill think about Ryan Tannehill's career today versus what it was in Miami under Adam Gase, where he was considered a bust. But at least he had Gase's system, whatever it was, for like, you know, for a number of years.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. So I think it's more about the system. The fact that Justin Fields is going to go out there and get killed in Matt Nagy's system, and then they're going to bring in another coach, and then you're like, okay, now what are you running, right? And so that's always the challenge there. It's interesting when you said mutiny. You know what I was reminded of? And make this about Washington, but I was reminded when you said that of the RG3 Kirk Cousins thing.
Oh,
because one of the reasons, because basically, like, and I love RG3, one of my favorite players of all time. I'm not sitting here, but for better, for worse, whatever reason, RG3 seemed to have lost the locker room, or just people felt like the players. Like, I remember talking internally here to some of our insiders here at ESPN, and they were, you know, they all know I'm a Washington fan, so they're going with Kirk. I'm like, they're going with Kirk, really? And he goes, listen, if Jay doesn't go with Kirk, he loses the locker room. The players are seeing it in practice. Kirk's the better player right now. He's the better fit for that offense of what they're doing. You remember that was sort of that they went with Kirk Cousins over a healthy RG3 eventually. Like, that happened. You know, they made that switch at some point. And I remember somebody telling me like they have to do it, otherwise Jay's going to lose the locker room.
Right.
Because the players know. And, you know,
absolutely. That's how the Jags lost their locker room, because they kept playing. They paid and then kept playing Blake Bortles. And I wonder, you know, Jimmy Garoppolo's played well. So as long as Jimmy Garoppolo plays well, it's moot. But based on some of the quotes we got from veterans in San Francisco about Trey Lance, you wonder if that's another situation. Kyle Shanahan obviously understands these things. This is awesome. I mean, this has been an awesome opportunity for the audience, for me to get to have this part of your time. I just want to say, since I finally have the opportunity to have you on the show here, we all owe you some sort of debt, because of one of the things we let off with, like, you've, by taking the weight on your shoulders that you did, and it has given you all these cool opportunities, but also you've pulled the sled forward for all of us, so that fantasy football has become an industry or something. And I think even just, it's also you have remained human through all of this, and it's something that all of us are able to benefit from. And that's why I'm glad I got a chance to have you on the show. We didn't just talk about fantasy football or who you're going to play this week or what you think. So thank you. And I hope and look forward to any opportunity we have to cross paths and work together again. And go ahead. I'll give you one last parting shot before we sign off.
Well, first off, thank you for saying that. That means a great deal to me. I appreciate that. When I was starting out in the industry, there were a lot of people that were very kind to me. And so it's really important to me. Fantasy football has been unbelievably great to me. You know what I mean? Like, without fantasy football, I don't get to ESPN. Without getting to ESPN, I don't meet my wife. I don't have my kids. I don't have my family. You know, almost every good thing in my life has come one way or the other through fantasy football. It puts a roof over my head. It puts food on my plate. It's allowed me to meet amazing people, incredible friends. You know, it's, like I said, it's brought me my family, and, you know, awesome, unbelievable experiences. So fantasy football has been really great to me. And I'm very appreciative of that. And it's very important to me to leave fantasy football in better shape than I found it. Push the ball forward, to use another sports metaphor. Yeah. And so that's really important to me. And so, you know, I've tried very hard to raise other people up and to be supportive of the industry as a whole. You know, I'm reminded of when I first got to ESPN, and they were like, "Hey, we're going to try to make a big push into fantasy, and we want you to, help us lead that charge, both internally here at the company and on our airwaves." This sounds egotistical, and I don't mean it to sound this way, but the quote that immediately went in my mind was the Spider-Man quote, right? With great power comes great responsibility.
Yeah.
And I just meant that, like, it wasn't necessarily that I had any power, but obviously ESPN is the worldwide leader in sports. And I was just like, if I screw this up, there's going to be a lot of people watching. And if I screw this up, they're going to be like, oh, fantasy doesn't work on TV. Fantasy doesn't work as a business. Fantasy needs to go back to the corners of the internet where it is. Like, the nerds in the basement can go find it, a small link at the very bottom of the website, and they'll go find whatever. And we can throw it behind a paywall because, those nerds will pay for whatever. But if I screw this up, that's where it's headed. Like, but I've got an opportunity here, thanks to ESPN, to try to bring it into the mainstream, to help bring it much more mainstream. And so I took that very seriously and worked my ass off. I still do to this day, but like those first couple of years at ESPN, like I didn't sleep for both, because I was like nervous about my on-air presentation. Not that I'm a great broadcaster now, but at least, at least I'm semi-competent. And back then I was just learning so I was super nervous about screwing up on live TV in front of millions of people, and also screwing up, like, I didn't want to, last sports metaphor, fumble the ball that I'd been handed. I've been given this great opportunity. So I took that very seriously, and it's worked out, and it's been an incredible ride. I've been very blessed and feel very lucky. And I very much appreciate that acknowledgement and those words, Sig, because it's it's been important to me to do so. And so the fact that it's been somewhat successful means a lot to me. And, there's many, many, many people that were on that journey before me. Joe Bryant, our mutual friend, Joe Bryant being one of them. Joe Bryant, one of the OGs, one of the legends of the game, one of my dear friends in this industry. But there are a lot of people internally here at ESPN whose names you don't know, but trust me, I know, who are fighting the good fight, both internally here and externally, to try to push the ball forward on fantasy. So, throughout the industry, shout out to David Dodds, right? I mean, like, just tons and tons of people, Peter Shanky and the gang over at RotoWire, shout out to Ron Chandler and the Baseball HQ crew. Like, there's a lot of guys that, men and women, that have, they're there before me, that helped pave the way, that made this industry what it is. But I'm honored and flattered to have, not screwed up my little part in it. So I appreciate that very much. It means a great deal to me, and I'll continue to try to push the ball forward. And to anyone that's in the industry that's listening to this, I would say, challenge you to do the same thing. As people help me, I've tried to reach down and help other people as they've come into the industry. And so, now it's other people, your turn to pay it forward. And I think the more of us that pay it forward, that are encouraging, that are, supportive on social media and elsewhere, that help others learn the ropes. Like, man, the more we can grow fantasy sports, the better it is for all of us, right? And I always say I can't rest. I don't get to rest until every man, woman, and child plays fantasy football.
Yeah, and that's a great way to end the show. And be like Matthew Berry, folks. Help other people. Be a human being. Don't take yourself too seriously, and help create a community that is one of the most positive and uplifting places. I think that's the biggest accomplishment of the fantasy community on the internet. It's one of the few positive, uplifting places. Thanks to you all out there too. Obviously, we're nothing without you, always, because you're so classy.